All right, we are live. Cool. Hello, everyone watching or going to watch. I'm Carter Henman. I'm a fourth-year debater at the University of Wyoming, and
I'm Hunter McFarland, and I am a graduate assistant at the University of Wyoming.
And we're going to talk about theory arguments. We're going to start with some general stuff. What is theory? Most generally, it's just arguments about what the parameters of debate should be, what sort of arguments people should be making, what sort of arguments people should be making arguments about. And you can use those sort of reasons, or you can use those sort of interpretations of what debate should look like as ways to create offense when maybe you are really being beaten on a counterplan and DA strategy that you don't have answers to. You can also use it in less like parachute-y ways to frame and filter specific arguments in the debate. For example, not the impact to not every theory argument is that the other team should lose. It can also be that the judge should not evaluate this particular counterplan or should not evaluate particular kinds of link arguments on a critique. And those sort of things can get you ahead in debates, even if that's not the entirety of your 2NR or 2AR strategy. Generally, you should get creative with theory because all of the popular, I guess, like conventional theory arguments that we're going to talk about today came from somewhere. They came from somebody who thought this would be a useful argument for me to make. It would be a reasonable interpretation of how we should debate. And they just did it one day and it started to stick. And that's how they came around. So I encourage you to get creative about what the ways you think you can use theory strategically in your own debates. Some of the, I guess, like the general form of theory arguments is that they need to have an interpretation. That is your vision for what debate should be like. For example, if you're trying to exclude, state counterplans in a debate, you would have an interpretation that says negative teams should not get to fiat 50 state action. And that would be your interpretation. You would have standards, a lot like a topicality argument, which are reasons why that interpretation is good. And those can vary. And there's also has to be an impact argument. So in addition to the impacts to each of your standards, you want to explain why those standards either justify, for example, rejecting the team, not evaluating the argument, or whatever else you're trying to use theory to do. Hunter has some notes on style, I think.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about some kind of stylistic choices that you should make when you're going for these particular arguments. So the first one that I think is very critical is that you want your judge to be able to flow every single argument that you're making on theory, which is why that you should start your reading of your blocks, or whether or not you have them, start off the conversation slowly during your speech. And you should always number your arguments as well. It makes it a lot easier for the judge to keep a nice flow of the different arguments. And then another thing to note is that while it's okay to have blocks and read them in debate, you should definitely make sure that you're writing your own blocks so you can have your own language in your blocks. That way, you are able to fully go for this argument in the 2NR and you completely understand it because you've sat down and you've thought about it and you've written it out exactly the way that you want the speech to go. And that also doesn't mean that you have to read the blocks in the debates, but it'll help when you write the blocks to be able to just spit off a few reasons why your particular theory interpretation is best. And you should also not be afraid to go all in on theory if you feel like it is the best argument against a particular counterplan, or you feel like you're really behind on some aspect of the debate and you need a way out. So going all in on theory in the 2AR on conditionality, for example, is not a bad choice to make at all, and even sometimes it is the right one, depending on where you're at in the particular debate. And so now we're going to go over particular AF theory arguments and then neg theory arguments, and then if there's any other viewers out there that want to ask some questions, we'll try to get to those.
I see we've got one now. Feel free to chime in with any questions. We have the live chat.
If there's any
pulled
other
up right
viewers out
here,
there.
and I don't know why it's doing that. But anyway, so yeah, I'm just gonna start if nobody has anything in particular they want to hear with some common AF theory arguments, and just speak a little more broadly about them. So we'll start with conditionality. And so I don't know how common this is in Wyoming, but it's certainly getting a lot more common at national circuit level in high school, and it's absolutely rampant in the college debate community. And it's this idea that negatives can have multiple advocacies, multiple counterplan texts, or multiple different critiques of the affirmative that they don't have to go for. That if the affirmative answer sufficiently makes a permutation argument, then the negative's just not feeling it. They don't have to go for it. And so there are some reasons why this could be problematic, right? Is that it, one, incentivizes negatives to think about their 1NCs in terms of just like how many positions can we fit into our 1NC, how many things can we throw at the wall, and then just wait and see what sticks. And so that's one argument against conditionality, in that it reduces the depth of discussion on counterplans and critiques in favor of just the ability to capitalize on 2AC strategic mistakes. And those strategic mistakes become a lot more likely in a world where you have to answer 3 or 4 different counterplans in your 2AC. It's the only AF constructive, the only opportunity to generate solvency deficits to them. And so when there's that much pressure on the 2AC, it essentially becomes a question of just hitting a checklist, and if you don't get all the checks, then the negative can capitalize on it because they have the block. And that essentially is an argument for why skewing the 2AC in terms of time and strategy makes it almost impossible for affirmatives to win. And so that is the big fairness component of a lot of conditionality arguments in the 2AC. The education component, you should always have in your theory argument, strive to have a standard that is based on fairness, which is not an impact in and of itself, but is a reason why debate would suffer if there were less competitive equity in this specific instance. And then you also want to have an education standard, because obviously, what's the point of having a fair debate even if we're not going to learn anything? So you should try to have one of each of those arguments, and you have some options in terms of which particular ones you want to go for later on in the debate.
Can I interject real quick? One thing that you need to remember is that cross-X of the 1NC, you should definitely be asking the question every single time if the negatives positions are conditional, and they'll usually give you a simple yes, or they'll have different ways of describing the status of their counterplan. And so make sure that you ask that question to establish your 2AC argument, because depending on the way that cross-X question is answered, you may have to tweak the way that you traditionally go for this argument. And so do you want to talk about the different types of interpretations?
What do you mean? Different statuses?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the way, in my mind, I just group it into 3 conceptual categories. They're conditional, in which case they don't have to be in the 2NR. They're unconditional, in which case the 2NR has to include that argument, has to be part of the 2NR strategy. And then there's this sort of nebulous world of dispositionality that is not nearly as fashionable, I guess, as it used to be, but essentially boils down to the negative will be able to kick a counter plan or a critique in a world where the affirmative has made a permutation argument and has not instead just decided to read a new disadvantage to the counter plan, basically. And so it's sort of shaky on the distinction between what is an offense and a defensive argument in the context of counter plan. But it basically, if the AF wants to say, you read this counter plan and it is a horrible idea and there are independent reasons why it would be bad besides the fact that it doesn't solve the AF, then the negative would, in that world where they have committed to being dispositional, would have to go for that argument, because then essentially the argument is that dispositionality allows AFs to read new offense against counter plans that negatives cannot completely disregard by kicking out of it. And so that supposedly resolves some of the concerns with why conditionality is bad. But of course, it sort of begs the question of whether the 2AC should be expected to come up with disadvantages to those counter plans in the first place, or whether they should be expected to come up with big reasons why 4 or 5, 3 or 4, 2 to 3 counter plans in the 1NC should all be independently rejected, besides the fact that they can't solve the AF or they are not competitive.
And if you're negative, I would not recommend ever saying that your counterplan is dispositional. There's really not a lot of advantages to it. You should, usually if you have multiple counterplans or critiques, you do not want to go for all of them in the 2NR. That would be a horrible 2NR to give, and you should avoid that at all costs, which means that you should just say that your counterplan and your critique are conditional. And then you wouldn't have to answer this 2AC argument, obviously, until the 2NC. And so then that's when you get to offer up your own interpretations of conditionality.
Okay, so yeah, I see we've got a couple more viewers trickling in. Just want to reiterate, feel free to post any questions on the live chat. We sort of have an agenda for what we want to hear about, getting at issues that matter that are relevant to Wyoming high school debaters. And sometimes we're not always the most in touch with that. So please ask some questions if you have any. The next general AF theory argument that I want to talk about is performative contradictions. And this sometimes sort of gets blended into conditionality arguments, but can also, the premises of it are separate and they have independent reasons why it's bad. Basically, the argument that the negative could be conditional, they could read multiple different counter plans and multiple different critiques potentially in a world where they do not directly contradict each other. So an example would be like reading, in most cases, any kind of counter plan and a critique will be contradictory. For example, if somebody's reading a CAP critique and a counter plan that says, well, we can just fund all this research that solves, whatever the AF's advantages are, there's a clear contradiction there, saying that one type of policymaking that's based on, using financial logic is bad, and then saying we should use that same type of policymaking to solve the AF. So some of the reasons that style of debating would be undesirable, and the arguments I always make in my 2ACs are based on advocacy skills. So the idea that in the real world, we would not be very credible advocates if we got up and made multiple conditional, especially contradictory arguments in front of an audience. And that could be, really bad, especially if you think about debate as an activity that trains us to go out and be good arguers in the public sphere. The second argument is just, fairness, specifically reciprocity. AFs don't get to make contradictory claims. Otherwise, the 1NC would just concede them and the debate would pretty much be over. Also causes strategic skew in a way that just regular conditional advocacies doesn't quite get at, because in a world where the AF is having to debate contradictory positions, for example, if you want to answer the if you want to answer a Heidegger K, for example, by saying that technology is good and it can solve environmental issues, while the 1 and C also included a fund some environmental research to solve global warming, then you have functionally conceded the premise of the counterplan that it can solve your affirmative, and the negative can take advantage of that. So that's sort of one example of how, you know, a world of contradictory conditional advocacies forces the AF to debate themselves, essentially. And so that's one of the best arguments, I think, against performative contradictions. Some of the negative responses that are common to this are just that, well, one, debate the link. Our arguments are not contradictory, so you don't have a reason that our form of debate is bad or that we should be rejected. Two, that being able to debate in front of, for example, an audience that holds contradictory views, not that one person in the audience is contradictory, but you will be debating in front of or advocating in front of people in most of your life that don't all agree with each other. And so being able to debate in front of heterogeneous audiences is a good skill that potentially, you know, contradictory conditional advocacies could help. Being an AF debater, I think that's all a load of crap, but these are some of the arguments that people make. The next genre of AF theory argument is pretty broad, and it's just about counterplan legitimacy. And so these are arguments like process counterplans are bad, or that counterplans that compete based off of having a different agent or is bad, or counterplans that compete because they have an agent that is outside of the United States specifically are bad.
Or they compete off the certainty of the
Or
plan
yeah, they
passing.
compete off of the fact that the plan is not conditional. For example, they can have a counterplan that says, instead of the plan, we will do the AF if, for example, we can secure some sort of QPQ agreement with another country, where we say we'll condition the AF on, you know, India fulfilling some sort of obligation to the United States or signing some sort of treaty. Those are conditions also known as quid pro quo QPQ counterplans. So we'll start with, for example, the state's counterplan. Certainly not as big on your topic because it is an international topic, but it's something I have to answer a lot. And so one, we start to see more clearly how interpretations and standards and impacts play in. For example, against the state's counterplan, I usually make an interpretation that says negatives get to fiat the same actors as the affirmative. So this is reciprocal fiat. The neg still can have counter advocacies, but they have to be limited to agents of the USFG, just like the AF is. Obviously, that is good because it's reciprocal. It creates fairness. It's good because it excludes, you know, things like 50-state fiat, assuming that 50 states can do exactly the same regulation at exactly the same time, is something that most people don't talk about in any kind of literature because it has never happened. And that makes it certainly hard for AFs to answer because they can't do any research based on it. And it lowers the threshold for the negative because it's an idea that has debate. It has debate convention on its side, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense in the real world. Agent counterplans generally, you can sort of make an argument that we should not be debating about who should do the plan, but only whether or not the plan should happen. Those sort of education and the same general theory arguments apply, or fairness arguments apply to agent counterplans. Counterplans that be based on the process of the AF. So for example, if the AF were a congressional action, instead the neg says we should submit some sort of report from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. public administration, majors where you're high school students trying to learn about foreign policy in more broad terms.
Yeah, so it definitely destroys the focus on topic education, which should be one of the biggest impacts in a lot of these types of debates, particularly because we change our resolution every single year and we devote a lot of time to it. And so we should be focusing on the ins and outs of those policies and those types of engagements with China, for example, rather than the specifics of the type of policy that we're passing. So yeah.
Oh, sorry. Curtis had a question. Would that prevent international fiat arguments on counterplans?
Well, you should just talk about international fiat generally.
We should talk about international fiat. International fiat is a pretty big candidate for being called cheating, just because the AF has access to a very limited, actor, right? The United States federal government, one country can only be expected to do so much, but the negative in a world of international fiat doesn't even really have to pick just one international actor. For example, they could say that the entire international community could agree on something, and it means that the negative gets access to like really abusive counterplans. For example, say you had a China war impact to your affirmative, the negative could just, in a world of international fiat, be like fiat that China, if the U.S. goes to war with them. And so you could see how in a world where the negative gets to just pick anyone in the international arena, any one agent or even all of the agents, and just have them do something, it would be impossible for the AF to, or have them, use fiat magic to solve problems.
It's infinitely regressive. It would be impossible for the AF to research every single person that would be able to do a certain action. It justifies even individual action counterplans. So even one of the debaters could be like, well, fiat that, my partner does this. And so it just becomes a spiral. And so it is a very good argument, or you should always make a theory argument against international fiat, because it is very difficult for the AF to keep up with those types of counterplans.
Sure. And it, is important too, right? Because we're supposed to be learning about how U.S. policy can affect its relationship with China, how not the other way around. And so there are some reasons why international fiat would be bad. Certainly there are negative reasons for why AFs should have to anticipate, other agents that could step in before the United States to solve global problems, things like that. But in general, I think it seems pretty weak, and I think that's where a lot of the consensus has come down in terms of, policy debate in the communities that at both levels. Okay. Last thing I just wanted to talk about is, we should check in with Curtis. It says chat is disconnected. Please vote. Oh, it says it's connected again. Okay. Well, I don't know if that answered your question, Curtis, if it did or did not. Either way, chime in and let us know. But the last thing I wanted to mention was critique theory. And so this can function a lot of the same ways that you would use it against a counterplan. You just focus on the text of the alternative and what the content of that is. If it's particularly vague, you can make the same argument they would make against a counterplan that says, we don't know what this counterplan does. You've clearly strategically written it so that we can't stick you to any of the reasons it would be bad or why it wouldn't solve the AF. And so we shouldn't be expected to answer it, especially in a world where the negative gets the whole block to clarify what they mean, and the 1AR is only 6 minutes long. And so those are, you can make the argument against vague alternatives, the same sort of reasons you could think about why having a sort of utopian international mechanism to solve AF impacts would be bad are also a lot of the reasons why alternative critiques are bad, right? If the AF says that there will be resource wars because of some tensions, the negative says, well, we just and capitalism. So everybody has equal access to resources. That runs into the same, like how can affirmatives respond to that? So that's, you can just think about a lot of the reasons why, big counter plans that solve more than they should. Basically, that's what K-alts boil down to a lot of the time. So, and then the other major AF theory argument against criticisms that has a slightly more nuanced impact than just, this thing was bad, or this is a advocacy, you should reject it because we can't answer it. And Hunter gave a pretty lengthy lecture that's up on our website that is about critical arguments, how to respond to them, how to build them up. So I won't go into too much depth on AF framework versus critiques unless people want me to. But this is an example where you should think about framework arguments where the impact is not only to reject the team, it is to say, for example, our AF framework is that we should debate about the effects of the plan, not things that we said in the 1AC. And so you can use that if you win that theory argument to filter out a lot of negative link arguments that'll be about the way you performed or the specific language that you used in order to say, now this is a debate about whether or not our proposed policy should happen and whether or not, like, the types of words we used in the 1AC didn't have much to do with that. Yeah, so that's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about for AF theory and some common neg responses to them. I'll let Hunter talk more about neg theory now.
And if you have any questions, definitely let us know. You can also tweet at our Wyoming debate handle. I'll figure out what it is because I'm not exactly sure right now.
Spencer's gonna tell us.
So if you have questions when you're watching this video and we're not on live stream, we can still get you a response. It's at YO debate. Okay, yes, at YO debate. WYO debate. Awesome. So I'm going to talk about negative theory arguments. We got some word that some of you all were wondering about, specification arguments, and they function a lot like topicality arguments for the negative, in that if the AF needs to answer them, because if they do not answer them, or if they don't answer them adequately, it's very easy to lose on this particular argument, absent any other arguments that the negative has in the 1NC. So the first one that I'll talk about is ASPEC, which says that you need to specify the agent in which you're enacting your plan. And so high school policy debate resolutions have generally always said the United States federal government should. We've had some college ones that just say the United States should. And so this argument just says that instead of saying the USFG, you need to specify exactly who in the USFG does it, because there are a lot of different definitions of what that entails. There's even definitions that say that the USFG means the states. And so there's a lot of just arbitrary definitions, legal definitions. So it's good for negative ground to specify the agent that is enacting the AF plan, particularly for counterplan competition over anything, because it's essential to see whether or not we can test who's doing the acting, so we could do a Supreme Court counterplan, or we could do a presidential order counterplan and executive order. And so those are only possible really to get competition if the AF specifies in the 1AC. Primarily because it's very easy when the plan text just says the United States federal government for the 2AC to do perm do the counterplan if you are reading different agent counterplans, because they didn't specify in the 1AC. So they'll just say perm do the counterplan, we were the executive, and give some justification for why they were always the executive to begin with. So the counterplan does not compete with the AF, and therefore is not competitive and can definitely not solve the F because it's already the F, and that still is AF ground, essentially. And then there's also reasons to specify your agent based on disad links, because For the same reasons that we get counterplan competition, we can get disad links based off of who is enacting the plan. And this is particularly important for like the politics DA, for example, because the politics DA usually assumes that the bill will go through Congress and that President Trump now will have to sign the bill. And so if it is an executive AF and they don't specify in the 1NC, then it is really easy to just sidestep a lot of disadvantaged links. And there's also some typical reasons that it's a good idea to specify the agent, like education. It's the best way for us to test the nuances of the AF and exactly how the plan is getting passed. And it's good for topic education even to find out exactly the way that our agents are interacting with different foreign governments, for example. I'm going to actually give you like a short example of what an ASPEC 1NC would look like. So of course you always need to have your interpretation to start with, and you should label that number 1 or A on your flow, and you should tell that to the judge as well with those to number the arguments to make it easier for the judge, like I said before. So interpretation for this would be the affirmative must specify who is enacting the plan. If it's the 50 states, Washington, D.C., the executive, Congress, whatever, your interpretation should be just that they need to specify. And the violation is the AF does not specify. And you always need to have a violation for why that they don't meet your interpretation. So a ground argument would be specification is key to neg counterplan ground is agent-specific DAs, and because it's impossible to evaluate the plan independent of institutional choice. And a lot of these arguments are being read in the 1NC with a specific piece of evidence that you'll see over and over again. It's a piece of Cosmer 94 evidence that says that we need to have a central focus on who is passing the plan, because that is where a lot of different choices come down in Congress or in the executive branch. And so it's good for education for us to analyze the way the policies get passed. So yeah, I think that is a brief overview of ASPEC. If you have any questions, let us know. And then now I'm going to talk about OSPEC, which is a little less common, and I think it has slightly less relevant or big impacts to it. But essentially, it's just the opposite of ASPEC. You overspecified your agent. So it does seem like you're in a double bind here. Either you link to an ASPEC argument or you link to an OSPEC argument. So it's really actually beneficial for the AF to not specify their agent because of that counterplan competition argument I was making earlier. But if you do, then you'll have to make sure that you're ready for this argument. And a common interpretation for this would just be the plan must use all parts of the government, and specification isn't topical. And obviously, you should try to read definitions for certain words in the resolution whenever you're reading like a topicality argument or these kind of specification arguments. And a common 1NC shell will specify the, which means the entire, and then government is all branches. So there's a Black's Law 79 definition that people read that says, it's the whole functions of the government, the Congress, the judicial branch, and the executive. And some standards on that is limits. They explode the topic because you have to research individual branches rather than just research the plan getting passed, and kind of what that does to negative ground. And then the ground argument is they can use tiny sub-agencies like the EPA, for example, or the DoD to pass kind of the policy, which makes it a lot more difficult to get DA links, because now you have to get links based off of that specific agent rather than just the plan being passed most of the time. And so it makes it a lot more difficult to do negative research. And it's definitely a reason to reject the team for all of the reasons I said above, more than anything. So yeah.
Sorry,
yeah.
Just one reminder. Yeah, we got the tip from our coach that somebody wanted to hear us talk about specification arguments. So we've talked about the ones that we know are most general, but for example, on our last year topic, or even on this year's topic that we're debating, right? We're debating climate policy. So people read some specification arguments that are specific to the topic sometimes, like you have to specify the level of emissions reductions that you do on the AF. And so if there are any like weird specification arguments that people are particularly reading on your high school topic this year, then let us know in the chat and we can figure those out a little bit more. And then just one other note is like, whereas with OSPEC, a lot of your T cards will be very much, all of your evidence will very much be like normal T cards that provide a clear definition of what things mean. In spec arguments, the incentive or negative cards should generally say that these things don't have particular meaning, that they don't inherently have one meaning, and that is why specification is necessary. And so if you're reading a spec argument, you probably want to front load a bunch of evidence that says the USFG or whatever term you're talking about is really vague. And if you're on the AF trying to answer these arguments, you should point out why, even if those terms might be vague generally or in the context their evidence is talking about, there are definitely some reasons why the AF was clear. And those are my only other thoughts.
Yeah, so typical AF responses is really just the way that you normally debate a topicality argument. You always need to have a reasonability argument. And Mary's topicality lecture on our website went over that quite extensively. And so I'd refer back to that if you have questions. But just, the AF doesn't make debate impossible by not specifying or over specifying the agent of the plan's actor, right? You still get plenty of ground, and usually showing what ground the negative already had in the debate is a good way to establish that argument. And then you should always make a cross-ex checks argument if they did not ask about the plan's agent in the 1A cross-ex of the 1AC. It's very easy to be like, we would have told you straight up, you should have asked us. And so that is definitely a good thing to make sure that you're looking for. So yeah, those are my thoughts on ASPEC and OSPEC. They're honestly not debated very much, particularly in high-level circuits in high school and college, because generally as a community, we've realized that saying USFG is enough because that's what the resolution says.
Right.
But yeah,
that's what your AF counterinterpretation should be a lot of the time, is that we need to specify as much as the resolution does, because that's the basis for negative prep, especially in the high school community where, you could be debating any AF from any team across this, country, and there's no set reason for why certain teams should have to specify, because you've already done your negative prep based on what the resolution said. So the AF doesn't have to do much more than that.
Yeah, but if it's an AF that you've never seen before and you're worried about not having any good case neg against it, getting really good at being an ASPEC debater honestly isn't the worst thing. It's definitely a tool to use when you have to. So I wanted to talk about a little bit more. There's not a lot of negative theory arguments, or I should say arguments that are theory arguments that are started by the negative. It's usually the negative has to respond to AF theory arguments. But another one that I can think of is theory on permutations that the 2AC makes. And these are really strategic for a lot of reasons, because permutations largely either sever out of what the 1AC advocated, or they're intrinsic. They add something that the 1AC advocated. And so, for example, permutation do both isn't usually an intrinsic argument, but if somebody says permutation do the AF and then do the critique alternative or do the counterplan next, that's an intrinsic permutation, and there's a lot of reasons to reject that specific permutation.
Like specifically do the plan and then
something.
And then the alt, or do the plan and the alternative in all other instances, things like that.
Basically, if they put a time frame on it, do something now and then do something later, it's an intrinsic permutation. And there's a lot of reasons why that is bad. Number one, just that it's impossible for the negative to get competition if the AF can just add on small things to the 1AC plan text, right? They can just add on the critique alt, which means that you get rid of all of your competition because largely the AF would argue, if they're going for this permutation, that adding on the alternative is enough to overcome the link arguments to the 1AC. And so it becomes very difficult for you. And it's just bad for education reasons as well, because the AF just gets to say that they're doing the 1AC and then just adding on this other thing, and that's just not very real world, and not necessarily how policies get established by any means. So yeah, intrinsic permutations are usually bad for those kind of reasons. Do you have anything to add about that?
Just
like fairness arguments. Obviously, it becomes hard for the negative to be able to, because then they have to kind of debate whether or not the alternative is good or bad.
Yeah,
that permutation.
I just like to think about it this way: like the AF could always come up with something that solves a link argument. So if you're saying the AF, I can't think of any examples right now, but that's the premise for why intrinsic perms are bad, because the AF could always add something that would resolve some bad parts of their AF. They could always come up with something to do to make it better. It doesn't really mean that something's not competitive.
Yep. And then the other permutation argument is the permutation is severance. So the permutation basically advocates none of the 1AC anymore, or advocates just parts of the 1AC, which is bad for mainly negative ground, because then they get to not advocate some of the parts of the 1AC that you get your link arguments off of for the critique, for example, or like I mentioned earlier, perm do the counter plan is severance, because it now is not advocating the 1AC, but whatever the counter plan did. Sometimes the AF can justify that by saying, we didn't specify enough for you to get your actual competition, and so the AF was already the counterplan, so permutation to the counterplan is legitimate. But generally, it is severance to advocate whatever the 1NC advocated and not advocate what the 1AC did anymore, for education reasons, mainly because it's not real world to just switch your views like that, and also it's very difficult for the negative to get competition for fairness reasons as well. All right. Do we have any questions you want to check back real quick?
Yeah. What is it called when they remove parts of their advocacy? Yeah, that is severance. And so severance could include removing parts of the AF advocacy, but it could also include, for example, not doing all of the counterplan or the critique alternative. Basically, permutations have to include all of the AF and all of the counterplan and nothing else. Otherwise, they're not a legitimate test of competition.
Another example would be perm do the alternative, or not do the AF in all non-mutually exclusive parts of the alternative is how it is usually laid out, which means that the 1AC can sever out of their representations. For example, if it's a security K and the negative is getting their link arguments off of kind of the way that the 1AC kind of framed IR or a terrorism impact, for example. And so saying that, we can pass the AF plan without the rhetoric of the 1AC is severance.
Yeah, those sort of permutations that are like, do it in all other instances, or the non-mutually exclusive portions. If you think about it in an analog to like the counter plan, if somebody read a state's counter plan and said federalism was good, the AF would, if the AF answered the state's counter plan by saying, no, we should do the plan and have the states do every other policy that ever happens ever again that solves federalism, that's clearly not a legitimate permutation, because it still does not prove why doing the AF with the states now is not net beneficial over the plan. if that sort of makes sense.
Yeah,
But
did that answer your question?
yeah, I'm not sure. Curtis, do you have other questions about severance,
Yeah, because
permutations?
it's really hard for us to paint an entire picture of the way that theory debates go down in a little amount of time that we have for a webinar. It's a very extensive discussion, and all of these arguments are ongoing and changing based on the kind of perceptions that policy debate is forwarding and whether or not people believe, I guess, in the kind of interpretations that you're reading on theory arguments. And so something that you should always do is just constantly be thinking about these types of arguments. Think about why a particular argument makes it harder for you to debate, and usually you can come up with a few reasons that maybe we haven't even talked about here today.
Yeah.
And so you should have these conversations with your partner, you should have these conversations with other debaters. Sometimes even LD and PF debaters like to have these conversations because they should be thinking about the same kind of arguments.
Yeah, that's definitely the best piece of advice. If you want to be a good theory debater, then you should be talking about it and thinking about it outside of debates, because I don't know, it involves a lot of thinking on your feet, despite the fact that a lot of people do it poorly and just read their blocks as fast as they possibly can. If you are confident in your own vision of how debate should work and what is the best way to debate certain things, and you have thought those things out for yourself, then you will be much better at persuading the judge that your vision, your interpretation is good. And then, yeah, one last note on style is use examples. We're kind of light on that in here. We try to provide some, but definitely when you're in, it's the same as when you're in a topicality debate. You can't just be like, the AF explodes limits, that's bad, therefore they lose. You have to provide examples for why, they blow the limit, they blow up this limit, which allows these specific types of AFs that mean that negatives are unable to respond to them in this specific way. You should be thinking about theory impacts in the same way.
Yeah, just like any other debate argument, you need to have a warrant for why your interpretation is ideal, and also warrants for why their interpretation triggers your impacts. And that will really help you just kind of conceptualize it like any other kind of debate. You need warrants and you need impacts to those warrants.
Okay. So yeah, to Curtis, I get your response. Sort of like a lot of judges will not, they won't feel comfortable voting on abuse, mainly because I think, and this is not a judgment because I haven't seen you debate, but a lot of the way people sort of make these arguments is just that they make an assertion that, especially if your judge is like not super experienced in debate, that like they assert this is the way debate is supposed to happen. They did not do that, therefore they are cheating, therefore they lose. And so that puts judges in a weird position, right? Because they themselves have to decide or they feel like they themselves are the ones who have to decide what is fair or what would be abusive or not in a debate. And when they're in that position, people don't usually make good decisions. So the point, I think the big lesson is to try to rephrase your language about abuse and calling specific things they did abusive or unfair, and turn it towards the debate about different interpretations about how debate should look, right? So instead of being like, in my 2AC, I can't just be like, they read a state's counter plan, I don't have any cards to answer it because how could I have them? That's unfair, they should lose. That wouldn't quite get to the level necessary. What instead you should have is like this: we start with an interpretation. Negatives should only be able to read this kind of counter plan. That's good because they still get to read counter plans that test the affirmative, but the AFs are able to have these sort of core responses to them that we wouldn't otherwise have if it were a consult or a conditioned counter plan. things
and
like that.
You should also not be afraid if you think that your judge is very inexperienced to just lay out exactly what your intent is for your theory debate. In your 2AR or your 2NR overview, if you're going for these arguments, you could be like, theory debates are not, I'm not saying that, they should lose because they broke a rule of policy debate. I'm saying that they should lose because I have a better interpretation of the way we should debate. And kind of just lay out exactly why you're going for this particular argument. It'll be very beneficial. You should also make sure that when you're going for these arguments that, or early on when you're even just initiating them, that you're kind of looking for the judge's like body language, whether or not you think that they are totally understanding what you're saying, or if they just look confused or kind of upset, then you probably shouldn't go for these theory arguments.
Yeah, sometimes you just can't. Sometimes you just won't have a judge, which is like unfortunate, but a lot of the time you should lean on the fact that policy debate is set up to let debaters decide what the rules are. And if you are very explicit about how you think that works and how you think that you should be able to, or you explain to the judge, why you should be able to have debates about how debate should happen, why that is good, then I think it becomes a lot more palatable to people who otherwise would feel uncomfortable being like, I don't really know what the rules of debate are, but it seemed like they didn't do anything especially heinous. So I'll just, I'll vote for them anyway.
Yeah, so I think that that is all we have for tonight. Remember, if you want to ask additional questions, to tweet us at WYO Debate. And you can also send questions to our Gmail, which is wyomingdebate@gmail.com.
Yeah.
And we'll try to get back to you as soon as we can. So yeah, I hope that this was beneficial, and good luck to you in your theory debates.
Yeah. Good night.